Josh, can you hear me? Josh, can you hear me? Okay, I don't know if you can hear me. I cannot hear you.
Hello.
Hello, I hear you now.
Okay.
Chloe, how about you?
Let's see.
Well, Indiana just went on a lockdown. Till April 7th, like Illinois. Yeah, it's pretty much similar to Illinois. That's what I was looking at here. Okay. So right now you're the only one, Josh, but since this is being recorded, I'm going to continue on here, if you're good with that.
Yeah. Is this just picking up where we left off?
Well, I'm going to start, because it's been a week, I'm actually going to cover probably 3 or 4 slides that we already have gone through, just to refresh our memory about because we're going to start talking about the French Revolution today, if you can't tell from the cover slide there. And you can see the slide, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, I can see it.
Bueno. Okay. So, there are periods in history where people, by nature, we like to organize things and, determine what is right, what is wrong, have yes or no answers, chocolate, vanilla. Simply put, organizing things like that makes it easier. Complications, though, like when someone's premises can be right but have the wrong answer, make things definitely harder. And this is partially why so many people find the French Revolution one of the most complicated and chaotic events in Western history so hard to understand. But try to understand, we certainly are going to do. Today, we're going to explore French politics, society, and the economy during the second half of the 18th century to first understand the unique background to one of the more convoluted revolutions in early modern history, and one of the more important as well as far as Europe. And I think as we go on in this class, what you're going to see is the history of Europe from this point on is a history of how to deal with the French Revolution in large part. In the 17th and 18th centuries, France was at the height of its European power. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had expanded French possessions eastward into Central Europe, and huge swaths of North America from Canada to Louisiana were under French control. And this empire and the wars which acquiring such expansive territory required, however, came with a pretty big bill. You can imagine the money it would take to administer all this. When Louis XIV died in 1715, he left the French state racked with massive debt. France's subsequent rulers, his son Louis XV and his great-grandson Louis XVI, not only had to contend with this state debt, but were forced to spend much of the 18th century maintaining an enormous standing military, trying unsuccessfully to hang on to many of these possessions. The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War here in North America, caused particular harm to the state's finances as France participated in both European and North American theaters of the conflict, and in the end, merely lost huge amounts of territory as a result. Their subsequent participation in the successful American Revolution further drained money from the French state, and while achieving little tangible results from France, as we've seen, other than the humiliation of their chief Western European rival, Great Britain, from time to time. So while the French state was racked in debt from the expenditures that came with war and empire, French fiscal restraint at court was non-existent. Both Louis XV and Louis XVI operated the French court from the Palace of Versailles, the same as Louis XIV had done. And they spent tons of money doing so. For example, Louis XIV's wife, Marie Antoinette, you've probably heard of her, had a yearly clothing allowance in the millions of dollars in today's money. Despite France being unable to pay even the interest on the loans it had taken out to finance its empire. The money to pay for all the spendthrift practices of France's rulers, both at home and abroad, had to be paid for by someone. And much of the money came from taxes. But in 18th century France, the two most wealthiest groups in France that you would think to tax to get more money were actually exempt from taxation. And those were the nobles and the church. And which meant that nearly all tax money came from the incomes of the poorest and most populous portion of the French society. To make matters worse, the French peasantry, who often only owned enough land to feed themselves and their family, were in the midst of a seasonal crop failure that happened from time to time. And they could hardly afford to spare any money or resources to pay for the armies and lifestyles of their royalty. But that's what they were taxed to do. Oops, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide here. Let me go back. I hit the button a little too long. So indeed, a particularly acute crop failure took place in 1788, an event most historians consider one of the touchstones of the ensuing popular uprising. Now, all this series of poor economic circumstances and lackadaisical government coincided with arguably the most important intellectual movement of Western Europe that we've already discussed, the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, French philosophers occupied coffee shops and held dinner parties known as salons, where discussions ranged from logic and reason to political and natural philosophy. And naturally, in the midst of such poor government, many philosophers attacked existing French institutions in their writing. Moreover, Many philosophers championed the personal liberties and rights to personal property that were first espoused by John Locke in England in the 1690s. Indeed, as the 1780s wore on, it became increasingly apparent that the American Revolution was going to succeed and implement a democratic, representative form of government that enshrined many of those same liberties. And a lot of French intellectuals looked to the American experiment as a model for the type of practices that could be implemented piecemeal into France. Aiding with this intellectual connection were the fact that the first American ambassador to France, America's pretty much premier only rock star at the time, was himself a world-recognized scientist and philosopher, Benjamin Franklin. And following Franklin, the new ambassador to France was Thomas Jefferson, who had just written the Declaration of Independence, and he assisted in writing a similar document for the French revolutionaries. So while the Enlightenment provided many of the high ideals and political philosophy that occupied the existing French order, popular literature in the streets of Paris, nicknamed Grub Street literature, gave voice to the popular anger and the opulence at the effectiveness of France's rulers. Numerous pamphlets, for example, were produced that showing Marie Antoinette at court orgies, poking fun at her bouffant hairstyle and inability to produce a male heir. So while popular anger was directed at the court, upwardly mobile groups of merchants, professionals, and proto-industrialists were upset with their lack of political involvement. They now had money, but they couldn't participate in the politics of the nation. And the prosperous businessman's livelihood was affected by decisions that made at the highest levels of government, levels from which they were entirely shut out. And it was in this acrimonious climate, in Paris particularly, that Louis XIV's chief financial advisor, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, called the Assembly of Notables in 1787. It comprised the nobility, the clergy, and a few representatives of this group of businessmen who represented the people. And there Calonne introduced a plan that would eliminate the French state debt, now perilously high. It's at 100 million livres. I don't know what that is in today's money, but pretty high. Matter of fact, the debt constituted more than what they were bringing in income every year in their GDP. And he did this through proposing the removal of the nobility's tax-exempt status. You'd think it would make sense, but the nobility are the ones voted on it. How do you think they felt about voting removing their tax-exempt status? They resisted, obviously. Calonne attempted to enforce the reforms without their approval, but he was met with considerable resistance from the regional courts called the parlements. And with all avenues exhausted, Louis XVI was forced to call the Estates General. The Estates General was the formal, you could think of like the Assembly of Notables was kind of a committee of the Estates General. The Estates General was the formal legislative body of France. But you got to remember, a legislative body during a monarchical period is more of a consultation body than it is a true law-making body. So to get buy-in from people to figure this mess out, Louis XVI calls the Estates Generals. And it's something that had not been called since 1614, so it's been over 100 years here. The Estates General is an assembly made up of the clergy, the nobility, and a representative body of the people of France. The Estates General had not been called, like I said, since 1614, and its assemblage in May 1789 had the opposite effect of what the French government had hoped. The third estate, which represented the people, the second estate was the clergy, the first estate was the nobility, had twice as many members as either the nobility or the clergy, and its members were informed at the opening session that despite them having twice as many members as the nobility and clergy combined, they would be voting by estate, so their vote was only 1/3 of the total. It rendered the voice of the people pretty much meaningless. It faced with opposition from both the clergy and the nobility. The members of the third estate declared this situation unacceptable, and despite some initial attempts at coming to terms with the other two estates, on May 28th, the third estate figured out this isn't going to work out, and they began meeting without the consultation of the other two. They kind of functioned on their own rules, independently, determining the legitimacy of French government officials. In other words, they're taking the idea of government by the people to now its extreme in France, where they are the consulting body of the people, not the nobles, not the clergy. On June 17th, emboldened by the joining of some of the nobility and the clergy to the third estate, They declared itself the National Assembly of France. Now, don't get me wrong. I did say that they had extended this to be the legislative body of France, but it was still a consultative body. They were going to consult the king. They weren't making laws on their own. They implored the remainder of the Estates General to join the assembly, but also vowed to do the business of France if they chose not to, that they were going to continue on as the representatives of the people. So while the National Assembly formed without the king's permission, the assembly considered itself to be acting in the king's interests, and originally they declared all their laws subject to royal approval. Among the laws the assembly enacted in these first days were acts claiming the prior taxation laws to be illegal and making promises to institute new fairer legislation. Though in order to pay French debt, they kept the old tax laws in place until something better could be devised. So despite the statements of good faith to the king made by the National Assembly, King Louis XVI was outraged by the audacity of the Third Estate. How dare these non-noble blood or non-religious figures step in and claim to speak for the country of France? Of course, not recognizing that they're waiting on him to lead. So on June 19th, only 2 days after the National Assembly convened itself, Louis ordered the estates to separate, and the building in which the National Assembly met closed while he prepared an adequate response. What Louis did not expect, however, is that the members of the National Assembly would just simply find somewhere else to meet. And the next morning, finding their entry barred by soldiers nonetheless, the members of the National Assembly just decided to go across the street to King Louis's indoor tennis court. And there they created and pledged the tennis court oath to remain sitting until the National Assembly had written a French constitution. In other words, they're just going to totally reorganize government now. They can't even trust the king to do this. Days later, on June 23rd, the king appeared before the assembly in person. He ordered the three estates that had formed the assembly to return to their respective chambers at once, and the king granted a constitution of sorts, though nothing near as progressive as what the assembly had hoped for. It pretty much kept intact the whole nobility structure of France. And though some of the nobility which had joined the assembly complied, all of the representatives of the people stood firm to the tennis court oath and would not leave, as they had not written a constitution themselves and their oath from the previous week had promised. So this was a major blow to Louis's power, because what do? You're the king. Sometimes it's good to be the king, sometimes not, I guess. Do you send soldiers in to force them back, and the people say, he doesn't even care about us, and start rioting and cause a revolution? You've already accepted some of their compromises, but you don't want to upset the nobility, which are your true political backing in the state. So Louis XVI is walking this very delicate line here. But after this show of defiance by the National Assembly, relations between the assembly and the monarch pretty much broke down. In addition, the people of Paris took to the streets and supported the assembly, creating a chaotic atmosphere in the capital. For example, Louis tried simultaneously to heed some of the demands of the National Assembly while also undermining it. On July 27th, he granted the National Assembly his approval as the governing body of the people of France, while simultaneously surrounding the building the assembly met in with French troops. So he's trying to play both sides here, basically. And when the assembly asked the troops to be removed, Louis offered to move the assembly outside of Paris, a move which would have likely have ruined the assembly's bid for power, because it was the people of Paris that Louis was afraid of, because that's where he was, or very near Paris. And those people, 1 million people, all poor, would have been pretty hard to deal with. You move the assembly away from Paris, where they can't connect with the people, then it becomes something far away from them, and they're not as upset. So this is because the National Assembly was supported by large mobs of Parisians, popularly called the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without pants. I guess they couldn't afford pants, as poor as they were. So the sans-culottes were largely the working poor of the city, upset at skyrocketing food prices and the opulence and frivolity of their rulers. The drought, the famine, the bad harvest had caused food prices to soar, and they were still being taxed at the same rate, and taxes had to be paid. So the sans-culottes supported the National Assembly, and their collective action played key roles in the breakdown of royal authority. For example, on July 14, 1789, the sans-culottes broke into the royal armory, seized as many weapons as they could, and stormed the royal prison in Paris, which was occupied by lots of people who their only crime was they didn't pay their taxes. And the Bastille is the name of this prison. They released these prisoners. Matter of fact, July 14th, Bastille Day, is still France's kind of Independence Day. They have large celebrations and things like that. So a lot of historians consider this moment to be the point at which Louis lost total control over the events at Paris. The poor people began blockading the streets, harassing soldiers, basically complete lawlessness. In fact, July 14th in France, like I said, is still celebrated as Bastille Day, similar to the United States Independence Day. Later in October 1789, a group of women, outraged that bread could not be had in the city for a reasonable price, marched to the palace at Versailles. They demanded bread, and historically, Marie Antoinette is told there are women outside, they're demanding bread because they cannot afford bread, and Marie Antoinette famously said, then let them eat cake. Not understanding that cake actually costs more than bread. And so, people just thought she was being rude. And what are you going to do? A group of old women or older women with kids, families, worry about all they want is bread. You're not going to shoot them and everything. I mean, that would A, unchristian, still Christian kingdom. B, what's that going to look like to everybody else? And so these women were basically turned away with that sentiment of that, oh, they expect us to go buy cake. It's like saying, you're thirsty, we want a glass of water, we can't afford water, we'll go buy some wine instead. It doesn't work like that. So in the first years of the French Revolution, the National Assembly tried to enact several reforms to introduce Enlightenment-style political theory and policy, such as in August 1789 when they passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And if you read the English translation of the Declaration of Rights of Man, it sounds eerily familiar because Thomas Jefferson aided in authoring it and used a lot of the sentiments he had put into the Declaration of Independence into the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This document was made up of 17 clauses, and it mimicked in many ways the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, just written 2 years prior, and the 1689 Declaration of Right made in England. The following year, the National Assembly further democratized France. They passed the Civil Constitution of Clergy that brought the Catholic Church in France under the authority of the National Assembly. So now it's a governmental structure. Additionally, they provided for the democratic election of all candidates to the National Assembly. Then they implemented a constitution in September 1791 that called for the Assembly in France's first free elections. And in the midst of all this, the one thing they didn't do, they did not get rid of the monarchy. Louis XVI was still considered the sovereign and the executive head of government. But what they were looking for was a model much more like England's, where the king had limited power and could only serve as the executive at the pleasure of and with the advice and consent of the legislature. So Louis XVI did fear for the safety of himself and his family because he was the primary centralized target of all this anger about the government. As the National Assembly hastily dismantled all the vestiges of his prior regime except his office. In the summer of 1791, though, Louis attempted to flee to Austria. Marie Antoinette's father happened to be the king of Austria. And he was promised safe haven by the Austrian emperor, brother to his wife, Marie Antoinette. So the king and his family were subsequently caught at Varennes and marched back to Paris. People saw this as a crime. You are fleeing the French people, taking the wealth of France with you. You no longer represent or care for the French people. Meanwhile, the rulers of Austria and Prussia who are witnessing this, and remember, their kings themselves are looking at this and going, something's not right here. If we let these people rise up against kings, what's going to happen to us? They were concerned about the situation in France, and not only because the Austrian rulers were directly related to some in the French court, but for what a popular democratic government could mean for the legitimacy of their own thrones. In August 1791, excuse me, both Austria and Prussia declared their support for the French king, and the Legislative Assembly called such after the elections of October 1791. In turn declared war on Austria and Prussia in April 1792. Subsequently, mobs attacked the Tuileries Palace in Paris and arrested the king in August. The Legislative Assembly suspended his powers in September. The monarchy was no more. So whether it's a Hail Mary at the end of a football game or guessing at the last few answers of a test when time is called, sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures. After the first few years of the French Revolution, France certainly found itself in desperate times. So while a constitution had been written and some progressive, Enlightenment-inspired reforms were being implemented, the government was again overthrown in 1792. The king was still in prison, and costly wars with Austria and Prussia were going poorly. The desperate measures the French undertook at this juncture resulted in the execution of the king and thousands of others in what has become known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror grew out of the events of the summer of 1792. The Legislative Assembly, which had ruled as France's representative assembly since the first elections in France were held in October of 1791, was overthrown in August of the following year. Didn't even make it a year. And this happened when the people of Paris were whipped into a frenzy after news of heavy French losses on the Eastern Front. They lost confidence in their government. Oh, you overthrew the king, you promised us all this, and now look what's happening. You're sending us to die against all these other countries. The government was replaced then by the National Convention, a body of several hundred officials elected to devise a new constitution for France and implement an even more radical revolutionary agenda than the Legislative Assembly had achieved. In other words, radicalism is winning the day here. For example, in September, the convention abolished the monarchy, which had continued to exist even though all its powers had been stripped, and declared France a republic. Widely disparate political philosophies created a tempestuous climate within the convention itself, as different factions espoused radically different plans for France. Meanwhile, the streets of Paris are a chaotic scene, as in September, thousands of prisoners in the capital and the surrounding area were massacred by mobs of panicked citizens. And these prisoners were mostly nobility, clergy. Further adding to the tumult, the convention condemned King Louis XVI to death in January 1793 and executed him by the guillotine, what they called the national razor. The other powers of Europe, startled by the implication of the execution of a sitting monarch, could have for their own thrones formed an anti-French coalition. And soon after, the convention declared war on this alliance of Spain, Prussia, Austria, and Holland in February 1793. So though many consider the execution of the king and the subsequent beheading of Marie Antoinette and many political prisoners who had supported the monarchy as the start of the Reign of Terror, the terror did not really get into full swing until the creation of the Committee of Public Safety. The Legislative Assembly put a few of their best officers relative term, together to form a committee that would serve as kind of an executive committee to make decisions a little bit quicker. The committee was first created in April 1793 and led by one of the men who engineered the coup of 1792, Georges Danton. The committee was charged with stabilizing France, ending the civil strife within the country, and defending France's borders from impending invasions from foreign powers. The committee initially attempted to do this through peaceful measures, but after its failure to adequately provide for the military, the committee was recalled and reconstituted in July with a considerably more radical membership. It was led by a man named Maximilien Robespierre. And he's a determined leader of the Jacobin movement, which was, very radical, extreme, the very radical, the sans-culotte, basically. Robespierre and his committee made it their personal mission to eliminate any enemies of the revolution, though exactly who and what constituted an enemy of the revolution was never made concretely clear, and oftentimes it was more, if you're a personal enemy of Robespierre, you might be an enemy of the revolution. To make matters worse, by the end of the summer, the democratic constitution drawn up by this convention had not been put into effect, and warfare within and without France's borders continued unabated. In response, the committee set up a provisional government wherein the convention was reduced to merely approving or disapproving of the committee's suggestions. So the committee now is the government of France for the most part. So with a radical agenda and near dictatorial powers over the French state, Robespierre and the committee set about eliminating those whom they viewed as subverting the revolution, beginning first with their rival political faction, the Girondins. And you can guess where they got their name. After executing the Girondin leaders, Robespierre famously published the Law of Suspects in September of 1793. The Law of Suspects essentially made anyone who spoke, wrote, or acted in any way contrary to the ideals of the French Revolution liable to be arrested, imprisoned, and likely executed in the name of safeguarding the revolution. Again, you can probably see the problem. What exactly are the ideals of the revolution? They're whatever the government says they are. If you disagree with the government, you are a criminal. Subsequently, Robespierre and the committee set up watch committees all over France to report on suspected opponents of the revolution. You were encouraged, oh, you heard mom and dad say something that might be against the revolution? Turn them in. Turn in your neighbors. Turn in your friends. Hey, you don't like that guy? Maybe we could just make up something about him and turn him in. That's basically what it came down to. These people Robespierre termed enemies of liberty. So what resulted was the arrest, trial, and execution of thousands of prisoners all over France from the fall of 1793 into the summer of 1794. In 9 months, approximately 16,000 French men and women, including 2,400 in Paris alone, were beheaded by the guillotine, again nicknamed the National Razor, and many others were summarily executed. Historians' best estimates are that 30,000 people lost their lives in the year-long period from Robespierre's installment as the head of the Committee of Public Safety in July 1793 until the terrors end in July 1794. So in 1 year, I'll bet you $1 to a donut that we lose less people to the coronavirus than Robespierre's reign of terror. I'm going to stop here and see if we have any questions before I go on. Josh, Leone's still here. Josh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
You have any questions or anything?
Can you see this thing? If I click raise hand on it, it pops up like a little blue hand on the thing on my screen.
Oh, I do see that. You know what? I was wondering how that worked because I have not seen it, and now I have something on my screen that says Joshua S. raised hand. Did you raise your hand during this?
Originally I didn't know when I should ask a question, so I tried to do that. But
okay, you can do that. Feel free to do that while you're doing it. I'll look for it from now on.
All right.
So we've got a little bit of time here. I am going to jump into what the results of the French Revolution led to. Leonie, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. So 2 of you are here today, and then whoever else watches afterwards. So I am going to.
We watch this afterwards. I'm assuming it'd be up on your page, or would it be?
It'll be on the Facebook page.
Okay.
Which let me. I got about 10 minutes here. Actually, I probably won't go on because of the 10 minutes here, but so I'll show you the Facebook page. If you want to stay with me for a second here. Okay, this is the Facebook page. It's called Teaching Philosophy in the Social Sciences. And it's kind of the central hub where I'll post stuff. So for example, I'll still send you remind messages for the Zoom meeting code each day, but I'll also have them on here. So for example, here's the one for today. You can see Western Civilization 2 Zoom class invitation for Monday on there. And then I'll put, that's where I'll also have the video up later on there.
All right.
So what do you think, Leonie, what did you think? I'm interested in your perspective on the French Revolution. How do you learn about it in Germany? How's it taught?
I mean, I don't know, we just see different perspectives of it, like the German perspective of it. And
what is the German? I guess that's what I'm interested in. What is the German perspective of it?
I don't know. I don't even remember it, but like how we got it taught, but it's been a while.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I know just from reading history that Prussia was very concerned about it. They thought it was going to overflow into theirs and they would just lead to chaos and certainly the end of, the office of king in Prussia, which was concerning to the government. But you don't really ever get to read much about what the average person thought about it. in Prussia. You always get the kind of what I consider to be the government line that, the people were really behind the king and they were upset about what was going on in France. They saw it as anarchy. And in Britain, they thought the same thing, but there's actually a lot of documentary evidence that the people actually really felt that. But was that because they were enjoying a more constitutional monarchy and a lot more freedoms and privileges? Or, was it because they were firmly behind a monarchy? It's hard to determine. So I was just curious how, what you were taught as far as a cultural hand down regarding how the French Revolution is viewed.
I don't know. Like, I don't really have that many thoughts on it, but
well,
I remember
your gut feeling when you were taught it, were you taught that this was a kind of a bad thing, or you taught like, wow, this led to a lot of freedoms? And
I think like the whole wars were like a bad thing about it, but like in the end it turned to a good thing.
Okay.
Like, maybe like that.
Huh, interesting. Given that Germany never really went through anything like, similar to the French Revolution. So it's interesting. Of course, Germany was so fractured too. I mean, all these little kingdoms and principalities. Prussia just happened to be the biggest. It does make me wonder, though, when we get towards nationalism in the next century and the push for unification, how much of that was the French Revolution? How much of the French Revolution was subsumed by Napoleon, do you think? And that kind of led to the German feelings about France because of their hatred of Napoleon.
Well, wasn't like Napoleon the emperor like of the whole French Revolution? Like he was like the leader of everything.
Well, he kind of he takes the French Revolution and turns it into his French Empire, basically. Robespierre in here kind of sets the model for one person running the government after the king. And people accept it, amazingly enough, after that's what they were really complaining about previously. And this is, compare this to the American Revolution, and it's fascinating because what you have in France is the Second Revolution. And the Second Revolution is something America had, but we dealt with it and kept our democracy. Most second revolutions lead to a dictatorship, and that's certainly what happened in France. Robespierre becomes a dictator, basically. And Napoleon just kind of follows after him. And that's who we're actually going to talk about tomorrow, is Napoleon.
So the French kind of went from having a one monarch to not during the revolution, and then kind of having not necessarily a monarch, but one guy at the top again.
Yeah, which is fascinating because you look at the English Civil War, they did the same thing they had Oliver Cromwell after the king because things weren't working out. They needed someone to make quick decisions, and not having an executive wasn't working out. So you see the same pattern in France. We need people to make quick decisions, but it's not you. You're not working out. So we're going to trust this one guy here. And you notice how they went from, the three estates to the tennis court assembly, and then they elected the legislative assembly, and then it just went to a national assembly, which was smaller, and then they just entrusted the Committee of Public Safety, even smaller, and then it kind of became Robespierre was the Committee of Public Safety in the end. It's fascinating to see how they kept thinking, okay, we just need to minimize government, let one person have more control, and that's what it led to. All right, well, you guys doing okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's
I'm 4 hours away, but it's fine.
How's everybody in Germany? Leonie, your family?
Actually not that great. My parents both got tested positive.
Oh no, so, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
So,
they went on a skiing trip, and what?
I was moaning.
Yeah, they went on that skiing trip in Austria, and they didn't know how bad it was there because they didn't make it public until 2 weeks after they went there. So almost everyone that went there in that time period has it now.
Oh no. So what are they? Are they pretty sick, or are they just showing symptoms?
Well, they have a fever and stuff. They have their symptoms, but they're doing pretty good. I think it will get over in a week or something.
Okay, well, I hope so. My prayers are with them. Josh, what about your family? It must be pretty hard to be so far away from them. I assume you're still here in Marshall.
No, I'm not. I'm up here.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
I'm with
Well, I'm
them.
glad for that
Yeah.
anyway. And your family's doing okay?
Oh yeah, we're fine.
Okay.
Actually, up here we just got snow.
Oh,
we got a good few inches.
Oh wow, we got snow a couple days ago, but it melted as soon as it hit the ground. So
yeah, it's still here.
Are you the one who asked me yesterday? Then is it snowing in Marshall?
No,
okay, well,
I
did ask me, and it made me think. Well, this person's not in Marshall, obviously. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions about the French Revolution, I've only got a couple minutes here. So if you guys don't have any questions or anything to say, I'm going to go ahead and end this meeting. And we'll be here same time tomorrow. I'll send out the invitation code over Remind so that you can come tomorrow and we'll talk about Napoleon.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Good to hear from you guys. Glad you're doing okay. If you need anything, feel free to get a hold of me.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.